the big takeaway for me, for anybody listening, is be intentional with the scouting and have a good idea of what you're trying to get out of that particular scouting day. Are you intending to try and find beds? Are you intending to try and find route travel corridors? Are you intending to find good isolated food sources that you can spot check on closer to the season? Are you intending to just, generally get a feel for the landscape in a new area and find where there might be hunter sign? And think about, when you're going to be hunting that time of year. Is it going to be an early season spot? Is it going to be a late season spot? The more contextual things you can put together as you're planning your scouting trip, the more specific you can be in terms of what you're actually looking for. And I think the more effective you can be.
Welcome to episode 15 of the HUNTXP Podcast. We've got with us tonight Jeremiah Stavne, back for the third time?
I don't know.
How many times?
One of those two.
Multiple times.
I was episode 1, and then
Yep.
I think I came back. I think it was my third time.
No, you were here for
No, it's
John
fourth.
Eberhard too. And the
was.
tracking story. It's your fourth time.
It is my fourth time. Dang. Time flies.
And Johnny's back for the every time. He's
Every
been
single time.
Been here every
My,
time.
my
Every time.
co-hosting responsibility.
filled. Okay, you're on a winning streak with your apparel. So would you like to tell us what you're repping tonight?
Yeah, another from Big Mike's closet that I stole when I was probably 15. This is a tree bark camel pattern, which is also coming back into style. This camel brand is called Five Brothers. I looked on the tag before.
Brothers.
Yep.
Dude.
Established in 1890.
Wow. That's
And the
awesome.
shirt
Legit.
might be that old. I don't know.
If you, chances are, if you wore that around a hipster coffee shop where I live,
Yep.
you might get offered money on the spot for that thing. It might
Probably.
just be like, here's $50
There's some really interesting people that live down by us.
for another time.
Takes
Yes.
all kinds of kinds.
Yes.
It does.
Yes. Some really wonderful people. Great. Well, here we are, HUNTXP Podcast. If you're joining us, this podcast we started a couple months ago. Friends, but folks who are trying to level up each other's hunting game. If you're joining us for the first time tonight, maybe expecting Garrett Prahl, he'll be on in a little bit. We are stoked to ask him questions. We could ask him about a ton. As you know, if you're a follower of the DIY Sportsman, he is just so knowledgeable in all those areas and meticulously shares that knowledge, which I appreciate. Just super detail oriented. You can do deep dive in a lot of different areas with his content. And he, much like Johnny Eberhard, super generous and not only sharing his stories of the big bucks that he's harvested, but also just how he goes about things and how I feel like he just loves to learn and he loves to bring people along the journey. So we get to be a part of that tonight. And we're going to focus in on scouting since it's getting to be that time for us up in the North Woods when, yes, one day the snow will melt. And yes, we will be able to go see the sign from late fall. So we're going to get into that with him. And I think if you're a first-time hunter or if you're trying out some new spots or looking into new spots this fall or any time of the year and you're doing some scouting, you're going to learn a ton from this conversation. So buckle up. First of all, we've been doing some more gear testing here. We've got some more gear testing coming up, but I have been, from our friends from the Irish Setter crew, sent us some more boots to try out. I don't think we've talked about these yet. Been rocking these, and I wanted to point these out because it's just about time for turkeys. You guys getting pumped?
Oh, yeah.
Jeremiah, are you going to kill
You
some
bet.
turkeys?
I might. I'm
might.
thinking about it.
Thinking about it. Johnny,
It's my hand turkey.
for those
Yeah,
For those
Johnny
just
is.
listening, Johnny's got his hand turkey going on.
He's
These muck
very
trucks are
ready.
awesome. if you are looking for a turkey hunting boot, these are sweet. There's a couple things. I did a full video review, so that'll be out on our channel. But if you're looking to pick up some new just rubber boots for early season whitetail or turkey, highly recommend these. I've been wearing them around and loving them. Two things I just want to point out about them that are different, make them stand out, and might be an asset to you. First of all is the athletic fit. They give this option for the athletic fit, which I got to be honest, first of all, was super annoying. It did not feel good on my ankle, but that's because there's a break-in period with these, like anything that you want to fit well. So I wore them around the house, wore them out on a couple hikes, and now they're just money. And the reason they're money is that I can full on sprint in these and I don't have the clunkiness that you normally do with a rubber boot. So if you want to go that route, if you run and gun a lot for turkey hunting and you're on your feet and you want all the other features of a rubber boot, take a look at these guys. They're awesome. They have 17 variations of this Muck Trek on Irish Setter. We'll put a link to this model below and go check out the other ones. The other one I really like, I don't know if you guys with your rubber boots, but most of my issues come with this front section. So they have this model where the rubber goes all the way up or a little bit higher. Most of them cut off here. I used to do the arrow lights, the lacrosse arrow lights. And 2 years in, they would just like flop over like that because they were just all foam and no rubber here. And they just had the little strips up here. And I catch brush and branches here. So I can't say for certain, but this seems like it's going to hold up a lot better. So there you go. Thanks, Irish Setter. This is what I'll be rocking in the turkey woods. So check them out. Link below. What do you guys wear for turkey boots? What's your turkey boot strategy?
Go ahead, Jeremiah.
I'm not going to pretend like I'm a huge turkey hunter, so I don't really have one.
Oh.
I'm not going to lie.
I will.
I've gone a few
like I'm
times,
huge
but
turkey hunter.
I've had muck boots, and those, yeah, I've gone through a fair amount of muck boots for sure, and those are the ones I've wore. So I am not a wealth of knowledge on what to recommend for that, but that's what I've used.
I have used my Danner pronghorns, and I have used muck boots as well, and I've been happy with both. Yeah, they've been great.
So I got a pair of muck boots, but the Muck Arctic Pros that I wear for whitetail. I don't wear those turkey hunting a lot, but yeah, there we go. Getting pumped. I should probably bust out my calls at some point here. So that first like opening morning, I don't sound like a dying chicken when I get out there.
Always a good idea. I do it
Always
in
a good
my truck on the way to work when no one is in there, because the first time I started using a diaphragm call in the house, my family was very annoyed.
That is the trouble with
little.
practicing the turkey calls.
Yep.
Just about any game call, actually.
I got to figure out how to start practice, not to change the subject, but my elk bugle, because I don't think my family's going to want to listen to that. And look kind of weird driving down 94 with an elk bugle in the truck, too. So.
Well, we just talked about how
figure
there's
that one
all
out.
kinds of kinds. You'll fit right in.
Yes.
That would be awesome. For my elk tube, I got that, and then I started practicing a few times, and she was 3-year-old at the time, just picked it up and screamed in it, and it was like dead on. It was like perfect.
It was like better than you.
It was better than me. And I was like, well, can you just come if I ever go out west, and I'll just pack you in my pack.
Did you know that you can use AI to become a better hunter? Here's what you got to do. Our team at HUNTXP has built a custom AI. We call it Crockett. And it is the combination of the power of AI and the collective wisdom of hunters for many years mashed up together and put right in your pocket, right in the field, where you can level up your hunting game. You can ask it things like, what's the best broadhead setup for my situation? What's the best day to hunt this week? All sorts of questions. You can take pictures of the snake you almost stepped on in South Dakota and say, is this a rattlesnake? That's something that actually happened to us. It's super fun. Our community's having a great time building this. We'd love for you to join in at huntxp.com. Join us.
Hey, let's do some Crockett news. Just one piece of Crockett news. It's looking very likely that in Minnesota, just like several years ago in Wisconsin, there is going to be an attempt for reintroducing an elk herd up in the Duluth area. Johnny, you've probably watched this unfold south of you a little bit in northern Wisconsin, and Jeremiah, you watched this a little bit too. Where does your mind go when you hear that news? Of course, probably several years from tags, but what do you think?
Yeah, so they reintroduced a herd just south of where I live, about a half hour south, 45 minutes south. And I have some relatives that live there. and hunt there. And when you go down to visit, they are standing along the highway quite often, which is really cool. And you get to see them, which is awesome. Their herd is so healthy now that they do give a couple tags. I can't remember how
is
many.
Is it up to a couple now? Because I remember it used to be one.
It might just be one. It might be, but they do give a tag. The funny thing is, in northern Wisconsin, you can bait, and so lots and lots of people have elk coming to their bait piles, which is neat. But they're like, it's so annoying because they just clean everything up. And now the elk herd has moved, honestly, just south of my house, as in less than a mile from my house. They have been spotted eating in the egg fields, and the farmers are not happy because an elk herd will just decimate an egg field. Yeah. So that's been happening. But they're awesome. I mean, it's cool to see them. I always think it's weird because I'm only used to seeing them out in Colorado where I hunt for them. And you'll be driving along the highway and you're like, well, there's an elk. And it just is super weird to see them up here.
Yeah. I've seen a couple in northern Wisconsin too, and a couple of them have the collars on them. I don't know how many have the collars, but they have a big white collar on them. Yeah, pretty wild to see them.
Yeah,
it's really nuts.
Obviously, pretty avid photographer, and I've always wanted to kind of go up there and see if I can catch them on camera. But you see people on Facebook groups all the time posting pictures, and like you said, Jonny, standing on the side of the road, just pretty. But it's just an interesting thing to see in northern Wisconsin.
Yeah, well, soon to be northern Minnesota, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of big woods up when you especially you get north of Duluth. I mean, there's moose and stuff up there in some of those parts, so that'll be very interesting and very interesting country. Big, very expensive.
Yeah, I hope they take well. I hope so. It'd be cool.
I think they will. I think they'll have everything they need there. I think they'll do very well.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time for Garrett. Should we bring him on?
Bring him on. Let's do it.
Well, Garrett, you're here. Thanks for coming on the HUNTXP podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. We've been pumped for this. I myself I'm probably a contributor of many of your hours watched on YouTube that you see, because I've watched a lot of your videos. I was unaware of saddle hunting until I stumbled across one of your videos, and the way you broke it down, the way that you took something that was kind of silly and foreign to me, and then you're like, oh dang. By the end of watching one of your videos, I was like, oh dang, I should do this, and this is exactly how. You just got a way of captivating the audience with detail, and with not just frivolous detail but important detail. So for me, a couple of years ago, 5-6 years ago, when I was taking another hard look at hunting, I spent a lot of time consuming the stuff you put out. So just appreciation from me, first of all. So if you're not familiar with Garrett's stuff, Garrett does a lot of stuff under the moniker of DIY Sportsman, which is a wealth of resource that you should go check out after you watch this podcast, obviously. But just first of all, thank you, man. Thank you for being so generous through the years. I know I'm not the only person on the internet who would say the same thing. I know Jeremiah has learned a lot from you as well. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those kind words. It's always good to hear when the work that goes into putting those videos is appreciated and actually, comes across in a helpful way, the way I intend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, those of us who don't know you, could you introduce yourself? And I would love for you to share something that the internet doesn't get to see on your channel. What's something that your friends would probably know about you, but not something that gets known because it's not maybe related to hunting?
Sure. Well, most people, like you alluded to, know me from the DIY Sportsman channel, where I've done videos over the last, must be over a decade now. I think I started in 2010 or 2011 posting videos. So yeah, close to 15 years now. And it's a mixture of hunting related content, but also a lot of DIY, either build related things or equipment tests, gear reviews, or just general how-tos. And it really started with the how-to type stuff and then grew into the other, formats as the channel kind of grew. And along the way, I've done a little odds and ends things, helped out different companies with some design related things, behind the scenes equipment or app related stuff. So that's probably where anybody watching or listening to the podcast knows of me from. I'm located in Minnesota, and I do a lot of my hunting either in Minnesota or Wisconsin, but I've also traveled to a bunch of states, North Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, Alabama one time. Pennsylvania one time, kind of a little bit all over the place.
Remind me, have you participated in any of the public land challenges that Tether does?
Not the ones that Tethered does, but the ones that the Hunting Public and Dan Infalt have done.
They're the ones who do it. Okay.
Can't remember if it was the first one or if it was the second one, but they did one in Southeast Minnesota, and I did that one with the group.
Nice.
Yeah, and I think the second part of your
earlier, you
question,
had like hip waders.
Well, I had boots that were kind of like a mud boot, you would call them. They kind of splay out splay out like a duck foot. They don't work well in marshes. Yep. They only work well if you have like legitimate kind of like muck, just flatten them up with no grass. Then they work really well because they keep your body weight spread out so you don't sink in. But there's limited times where those actually come in handy, but they're nice when they do.
Nice. You were going to answer a part of the question that I asked before.
Yeah. I don't really know what to add that people might not know about me, except that I occasionally still get asked if I hunt full time. And the answer to that is no. Outside of all the YouTube and hunting related stuff, I have a day job. I work in medical device engineering and product design.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Would you like to hunt full time? Or are you like, nah, I just want to keep this hobby / side gig light?
That's a really good question, because if it was really just the hunting, that's a different question than what hunting full time actually entails, which usually means it's more of a job. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff. And some people, realize that, and there's other people that don't really realize it. But for anybody that's in that industry, there's a lot of work surrounding the actual just hunting. There's very few people that have people and staff that handle all the other stuff, and they really just hunt and go to shows and whatever. Yeah. No, I don't know that I would necessarily want that for myself, because I'd rather have hunting kind of stay that escape and that time where I can get away from the rest of the stress of my life and be able to spend some time outdoors.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Love that.
That's good. Well, man, we could ask you about a ton of stuff. We've already mentioned like 3 or 4 different things we could totally get into, but just because of the season we're in, we want to talk about scouting, and we have all learned a lot from you. And so we've got a series of questions, but before we get into it, I think Jeremiah has something that he wants to talk to you about first.
So I started following you on YouTube 5 years ago, and like that was one thing that really like helped me, and that's actually how I found you, was again saddle hunting. That's something I piqued an interest in. And so found your channel. And so I was kind of binging those and started following some of your hunts, like the challenge like you mentioned, and some of your other hunts. And then you started posting a series, I think it was 4 years ago, on scouting. And you got to marshes. And I remember specifically, I jumped in bed when I was married at the time, and I flipped open YouTube and I saw your latest thumbnail, and I looked a little closer. I was like, yeah. And you had like just dropped it, and you're like, yeah, how to scout marshes. And I very much recognized the I think it was like Onyx at the time, but the screenshot of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, no way. And I click on it, and you're in right away in your intro. You're like, hey, I don't know where this is. Like, I haven't heard this specifically. I'm not picking it because I know it's good. I'm not going to pick a friend's spot because I know. And so it was just so funny. So I know that it wasn't like intentional, but it was like 4 minutes from my house, and was a pretty darn good spot. And so I knew from that second on, there was no way on earth I was going back to that area. And the funny thing to even add on that was, I had some buddies a lot of my buddies hunt, but some specific buddies that I'm not saying it was related to that video, but they started like creeping into that spot too. So like, all right, that spot's just gone. But it was a pretty good spot. And it was just funny because I know that it'd be so hard to pick a random spot, no matter what spot you pick in any state, you're picking someone's piece of public. But I remember I commented, I'm like, that's 4 minutes from my house. So like,
show them the comment. Show them the comment.
You have the screenshot of this.
I screenshotted it today for fun.
It's so awesome.
Sorry for the screenshot of your face in particular, but I'm like literally 5 minutes from where I live. Anyway, so no, that's just a funny thing I wanted to confront you on, but way to ruin my spot. Thank you very much. No, but I've learned a ton from you, bro, and I know it'd be really hard to pick a spot to like demonstrate what you're talking about. So
yeah, that is harder than one would think, because especially with marshes, because
I'm sure
you usually don't get big marshes like that unless they're a big, like giant chunk of public, right? Whereas like other, like farmland, places are a dime a dozen. I started now just like trying to pick places that are in as low population centers. Like, I don't know if you watched my last video or not, but it was just, I turned all the layers off. So I'm just completely blinded if it's even public or not. And just, picking spots that at 10,000 foot kind of look like what I'm trying to explain.
Yeah,
Totally.
Yeah, because we live in the same city, obviously, big, like, citywide, but I know in similar areas. So it just happened to be that you were talking on doing e-scouting. I'm like, why did you have to pick that spot?
That's okay. Obviously, you've done just all right, Jeremiah. You didn't.
No, it's just one spot. I mean, in that area that you picked, like, I don't know, you hunt roughly in some of the areas within like 2 counties of there, but a lot of area up there, and it just, you had to use an example, and just happened to be that one.
Well, Garrett, so let's just think about, say we are kind of scrolling on OnX at night, or we get permission from that one piece of property that we've always wanted to. I would love for you to walk us through and our audience through kind of from e-scouting all the way through boots on the ground. How do we go about doing this? And specifically, I mean, we've already covered with John Eberhard. That was a big revelation that I learned from him and you, is scouting in March when the snow melts, when the sign is preserved. So let's just assume that. And first of all, with the e-scouting, when you pull up an e-scouting something on OnX, what are the first things you're looking for? What are the first things you're targeting in on as you prep to do a scouting trip?
Sure. There's a lot of qualifying questions to kind of go through before I really know what I'm going to look at first. What kind of habitat it is, how big the property is it near a big population center, is it kind of out in the middle of nowhere? Are there big parking lot areas, or for the most part, you're going to be parking on the side of a county road to be able to access? All those things kind of determine how I'm going to start looking at it. But let's say, for instance, it is a little bit bigger area. Maybe there's parking lots, but then there's also the ability to kind of park wherever you want on the side of the road. I'm going to look at oftentimes where either the most amount of diversity is, if it's kind of a flatter area, or if it's a little bit hillier place, what are some common features or a lot of terrain diversity? I found that with hills, if you have those just textbook e-scouting things that everybody looks for, whether it's saddles or a big like primary ridge system or where a lot of ridges collect and you get those hubs, more often than not, those are going to be hunted, and you go in there and scout it and find a bunch of hunter sign. But if you have areas that are so diverse with the topography that it's hard to pick any one place that might be better than another from a map, that's usually going to be better than nothing. And if it's flatter land, if I can find a lot of diversity, that means a lot of edge. Then that means that, again, not everybody's going to be diving in and e-scouting the same spots. And you're always going to have those spots where it's like, oh yeah, there's hunter sign here for sure. But if you've got a lot of plan B, C, D, all the way down the line spots you want to check out, where you're looking at the map and you're like, man, if I want to tackle this, 500 acre sub chunk of a bigger area, it's going to take me 2 or 3 days just to walk all the edges. That's an area that is going to be more appealing to me on the front end than an area where it's like, oh, wow, look at how this spot just stands out. It looks perfect. I'm going to go in there and scout it. Because more often than not, that spot's going to be already hunted and have hunter sign and maybe not really a good plan B or C spot. So that's kind of the very first step for qualifying those things. And then I might go through and find, that 500 acre chunk. And then maybe I find another 500 acre chunk that's kind of similar, has a lot of edge, then maybe a third one. And then I go through, one weekend at a time and start chipping away at those. And by the time you get, second one, third one, you have a pretty good idea of which ones are better than others. And that can help guide additional e-scouting, especially if it's a newer habitat type. When I started hunting in a little bit bigger woods, not just strict like cattail marshes, but bigger like rolling, like northern Wisconsin type habitat, where there's some swamp, there's some rolling hills, there's some oaks, there's a lot of clear cuts, some creeks and alder swamps and whatever. There's just a lot of edge, and there were some things that I thought were going to be dynamite, and some of it was because it had similarities to things that I had found in other swamps or other marshes. But then there's a lot of other stuff that I started learning as I scouted it that now I have developed a little bit better eye for, and I can look at those spots that were, previously to me not standing out as much. But it's kind of like they go hand in hand, the boots on the ground and the e-scouting, where you can't just e-scout. You got to complement it with the boots on the ground. At least that seems to be the most effective way for me.
That's good. You've mentioned edge a couple times, and I just want to clarify that's because whitetail are edge creatures for one, and two, I'm imagining that you're anticipating hunting those spots at particular times in which bucks are cruising. Am I thinking about that right? Or is there any other reason why you're identifying edges than those two?
I mean, edges are really easy to find sign in generally, and they can also be good places to find bedding, depending on what the edge is, right? A lot of times, if it's like a marshy, swampy area, you might not find bedding right out in the middle of nowhere. It's usually going to be relating to something, whether it's a little pocket within that area or whether it's on the edge where, the hardwoods kind of dip in and out a little bit, make like a little island or a little peninsula or a little cove. And the same thing is true on like the edges of clear cuts. Sometimes you'll find beds and you might kick up does just kind of randomly, it seems like. But a lot of times those more defined beds have some kind of meaning to them when you actually see one that looks like it's worn and it's been used a lot. And then you look at the map and you kind of look around and you're like, okay, this kind of makes sense. And oftentimes it is a little bit closer to the edge. So, edge could be where you're going to find the sign, could relate to bedding, could even be that if you can't access directly on top of the bedding, maybe there's food along that edge too. And that's going to be the least amount of travel distance if you're on that like bed to food early season. But like you mentioned, like the travel corridors and kind of that rut timing, that really translates well to this early spring scouting. I find that if I'm targeting and trying to be successful early season, I'm almost better off a lot of times scouting like live, right? Just like staying on your back, walking in, and just not letting the spring stuff predetermine where you're going to go and just hunt whatever you see. But for the rut sign, that stuff's really well preserved. And especially if you see historical sign, like all these big fresh rubs, scrapes from last year, and there's historical stuff all in this little area. The edge makes sense. It's good cover. You're looking at the directions that the bedding are at. And it's like all this stuff kind of converges. And it's like, yeah, that's probably going to be a good rut spot every year. And that's the stuff that you can really find once that snow is melted. All that sign is just there and exposed, and you haven't got the green up yet.
And that's interesting that you say for early season, you're almost like scout to hunt right there. Is that because food to bedding patterns change from year to year, and it's more about getting on that pattern that they're on that day and that moment, like finding the hot oak tree that's dropping or finding the apple tree or that sort of thing? Are we understanding that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the early season food sources are going to change, and because the woods are so dense early season, a lot of times it seems like the bedding is not even always going to be in the same location as it's going to be once the stuff starts to die off and the leaves start to fall. I learned that a lot once I started traveling out into the Dakotas to hunt early season, and in Nebraska, where there'd be a lot of times I'd go and scout or hunt in areas that look good on a map. And you'd find that historical sign, but the deer just weren't there yet. And you'd bump deer in places that you didn't expect them to be because they seemed too obvious or they're too close to the road or whatever reason. Well, maybe back here in Wisconsin or Minnesota, by the time the season opens up and you're hunting in mid-October or whatever, they would be bedding in different locations. But early September was a totally different game. You still had soybeans that were green. You had white oaks that were actively dropping. And you had just these super dense wooded areas that the deer could bed as close as they want them. As long as they weren't getting harassed, there was no reason for them to bed further away. And so I found that when I looked at my numbers, I would do better hunting early season out of state than I would do hunting early season in the states that I live in. I think a lot of times it was because my historical knowledge and the scouting led me to believe that the deer were going to be in areas where they weren't quite at yet. But I didn't have that background when I go out of state. And so I would just hunt based off of what sign I was reading. And I ended up having more success doing that.
That's good. Before we move to boots on the ground, Jeremiah or Jonny, do you have any more e-scouting questions?
I have some, well, just kind of what you're saying is resonating. So I have a piece of property that I live on at 50 acres and so I walk it all the time and I see the sign all the time and I see, during the rut, there's a scrape in this spot, whatnot. But I do get into the habit of kind of what you're saying. You've done better out of state than in state where you live, because I don't know why, but every year I'm like, I expect the deer to be here right now, fully knowing that they only come through that, or that spot really gets hot during the rut because I have does on my property. But I will still set up early season every once in a while. Like, okay, maybe this year they're going to come through early season, but they don't. So just listening to you talk about that, I'm kind of like, yeah, it is historical sign. It's made during the rut. It's there every year. Don't waste your time doing that. Don't even hunt that until that time of year. I feel like I make that mistake a lot.
Yeah, I made that mistake a ton when I was first learning, because a lot of that first learning was the early spring scouting. And then you'd find those just dynamite spots on one opening day because you were so excited from that knowledge of what you need past spring. It's just not the right time.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I'm walking and like shed hunting, I'm marking spots on Onyx and everything on near my house or in other spots where I hunt. And then you, like you said, you want to hunt them opening weekend, and you go there and you're like, I didn't see anything.
Totally. Well, let's move to boots on the ground then. So you talked about like game planning access. You alluded to it a little bit, but it sounds like you attack those edges early. So what's your strategy going in, or what do you typically pinpoint, and then what are you looking for as you go?
If it's like an early spring scout, or if it's like a in-season scout?
Early spring. Yeah.
So if it's early spring, then I'm usually looking for a combination of two things. Maybe I'm specifically looking for one or another on any given day. But the two things I'm looking for is opportunities related to rut hunting and opportunities that are related to early season bed to food. And the early season bed to food is a lot easier to find if it is a marsh type habitat, because I can find the beds pretty easily in that type of habitat just by, again, following the edge, but also looking for either the oak islands or the little shrubby islands surrounding the oak islands that the deer will oftentimes bed on it, till they move to the food. And by looking at the maps, especially if you're changing the time period and leaf on, leaf off, it becomes a lot easier to just like look at a map and see that kind of stuff. And it's really quick and easy to spot check. So it's not always like a grand slam, but if you can go in and find that, yep, this is where the deer are bedding, like for sure, like there's the hair on the bed, it's like well matted down. You find a few of them in like a little pocketed area, and 200 yards from that or 150 yards or whatever, there's a couple big bur oaks or white oaks, depending on the elevation. It's like, well, that's where they're going to move. So then it becomes a question of like spot checking that before the season starts to know if that's going to be an area that the oaks are dropping in. Because if it is, then for sure it's going to be a spot I'm going to want to hunt. So I'm looking for stuff like that, but then also the rut stuff. And the rut stuff, I'm usually looking more for the edge in the context of the bedding. So bedding is always that ultra useful information to know, whether it's buck bedding or doe bedding. And I'm less specific now than I used to be in terms of trying to find a buck bed, because for me, that hasn't been as high of an odds game as finding multiple areas of doe bedding and then just hunting the travel corridors in between. And I know it's super successful for a lot of guys like Dan, for instance, right? But I think when I analyze like the way he hunts early season and the number of sits he does and the statistical game that he plays until he catches up with one of those bucks compared to what I'm able to do, I tend to have better odds shifting to that like late October time frame. It's usually like when my best success starts and then goes through November. Obviously November is more random, but late October you can have good numbers statistically and also feel like you're calling your shots and not just totally getting lucky. And a lot of times that is in very close proximity in relation to thick doe bedding, then corridors between and or downwind that combine a lot of things that have a lot of edge. They condense travel movement and the rut sign backs it up. Lots of scrape lines especially, and then big rubs never hurt to see.
What are you trying to key on specifically on like for doe bedding areas? Let's just take marshes, for example. We mentioned it a couple of times. So what have you been the key characteristics of knowing it's a doe bedding area in particular rather than a buck bedding area with 2 or 3 spots? Is it mostly just the number of beds that you find, and you find that they typically come back to the same bedding areas in the areas that you've hunted? Or what's been kind of like, to key in on doe specifically, what's been a success point for you?
Yeah, so quantity and just kind of general proximity within the bedding because you might have bucks and does that bed in the same like little pocket of brush, right? But sometimes they'll have different areas and where they'll sit amongst the brush. So if I got a pocket of beds and there's smaller beds and they're like in the middle, and a lot of times that might be doe bedding. If I find a bed that's on the edge or a couple beds that are on the edge, maybe that's a buck, right? He's just repositioning a little bit, especially if it's bigger, and especially if it's got the tine marks or if it's just like rubbed up a little bit. And if I can get eyes on a deer when I'm spring scouting and I jump it, a lot of times you can tell too if it's a buck or a doe, even if he doesn't have antlers on, just from the size. And that's not necessarily a guarantee that he's going to be bedding, at that same exact location. But it seems like with marsh, a lot of the times the beds, provided the food is there, white oaks, red oaks, etc., they're still going to use those bedding areas. They seem to not shift around quite as much as they do in other habitat types. Like big woods, it seems like they can move around quite a bit more depending on what the habitat thickness is and what the hottest food source is right now. But it's so much more defined in marsh country that's a lot of times what I'm looking for. So it might be that there's, mix of cattails and like wiregrass and hummocks or whatever. And let's say you've got a chain of 10 total islands. Some are oak dominant, a little bit higher, good canopy, not much understory. You can kind of see clear, through across the bottom from one side of the island to the other. And then you got the other style of islands where it's that brushier, shrubbier. And those usually are the ones where I find the bedding. And then obviously they're moving to those bigger islands to feed. But then if you scout all of those islands, then you might find that there's some mix of bedding on all of those shrubby, brushy islands. And even like some of those bigger islands might still have beds adjacent or on them if there's like a little like brush point on it or something. Or if there's just like a random log. One time I saw a deer bedding. It was a pretty open island and it was just bedded next to a log, right? So stuff like that can happen too. And in those instances, it's a little bit harder for me to like always decipher, like for sure, this is a buck bed or this is a doe bed, but it might not also be like that important either, because you might be hunting the same spot regardless of if, the does or bucks are bedded in relation to one another a certain way. Like if the buck's bedded on one side of the small island versus the other compared to the does, but you can't hunt on that island without blowing the deer off. You're hunting on the next island you think they're going to move to. It's like, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter as much. But I do, to answer your question, I find both of them bedding in some of the same areas. It's just like spot on a spot specific where you might find differences.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
So a number of our audience, I mean, we don't have a good handle on our audience from all over the place, but we know just personally a lot of people are up in the Northwoods, which is where you do some hunting as well. So what different things are you looking for in that context versus a marsh?
Yeah. So water seems to be important. I find a lot of sign around water in the bigger woods, whether it's a creek or whether it's a bigger beaver dam system, or if it's just kind of like a flooded, like not like a cattail marsh, but just a wetland. Because from what I've noticed, it seems like whereas in marshes, you'll have deer that just frequently travel through the water and don't always avoid it. Seems like with the bigger woods, a lot of times it's more common that the deer will walk the edge of the water instead of just like plowing clear across it. Even if it seems like the water is not that deep. Like a lot of beaver dam systems, it's like, it doesn't look like it's that deep, or it's like a lot of grass, not like full blown water, but there's no trails going across it at all. But there's like big heavy trail systems that go parallel to that marshy or beaver dam system. Same thing could be true with creeks. It's like they might cross it here and there, but by and large, more of the science seems to be going up and down them. And so if you have water that creates a lot of edge, where you have like one system meeting another system, one creek, running kind of adjacent to a pond, where that chokes down those trails, or you zoom back out to the 10,000 foot level and you just look at all that edge created by the water and see where it naturally chokes down the deer movement. It seems to mix pretty well with what I've actually seen in terms of rut corridors, especially. So water is like a big one that I'll look at first, but then also clear cut activity tends to be another really big one to isolate and find edge. So I might even search out areas that have been actively logged recently and ignore an area that has nice, like pristine looking, like mature timber throughout it.
Yeah, totally. That's great. Okay. Any other questions, guys, at this point?
Good.
All right. So once you get a beat on the deer activity and you start to move towards like, how do I hunt this mode? What are the things you're looking for in spring in terms of access, trees to hunt out of? What have you learned as you've gone to that level of game planning in the scouting?
Yeah. I'd say for me, it's usually access 1, tree 2. And if it's an area that I plan on hunting during the rut, we like to say that you have to be in the right tree location-wise, and that's what matters more than anything. But just because it's in the right location doesn't mean you can get drawn back. If it's like just a totally exposed setup, and you get away with so much early season that you can't get away even late October once the leaves have fallen. So that plays a big role in kind of how I think about the tree side of things. But then again, like access-wise, the perfect spots rarely exist where you can just get in clean and get out clean. I found a couple of them where, let's say it's a small creek that I can just barely cross, and on the far side of that creek, you have a little strip of timber right downwind of like a giant clear cut. And so you have deer that just kind of cut between the clear cut and the water. And so you just cross the creek, pop up in a tree, boom, you're right there. You got the wind blowing your scent out over the creek behind you. And it's like the perfect access as long as you're willing to cross that creek. But then I have other spots where it's like literally the only way I get back to that like perfect spot that just looks fantastic scouting is by actually walking down like a quarter mile of deer trails. There's just no other way to get back there. And so for those areas, I still had a lot of success. Some of the hunts that I've even shown on my channel where I see like 6-7 different bucks over like a 2-day span. Those are some of those types of areas. And to a certain extent, it seems like they don't care as much about your boot scent as they do actually getting a whiff of you like real time in the tree. It's a totally different reaction. I've had actually the 2 biggest bucks that I've laid eyes on public land, one being that one and another being one that was not as big antler size wise, but was probably about 50 pounds bigger. They both walked directly in my boot tracks down my access trail. So kind of lightened up on the care or the fear so much of deer smelling my boot scent. But obviously I understand also that has a cumulative impact where, yeah, maybe the first time they had that little curiosity or whatever, but if they keep smelling that scent, then that's like just the odds go down sit by sit. So I might spare those spots for like when I think the timing is just perfect. I might hit it hard there for dark to dark 1, 2, 3 days, and then starts to slow down a little bit, and then I'm going to a different spot. And just, because I figure I burned it out by that time.
Totally. How do you just curious about marshes and access? Are you cutting through the cattails sometime, or do you have to kind of weave through islands? How do you because then is noise a factor, or how do you factor that in that environment?
I mean, I'm usually walking deer trails in those scenarios to get from island to island. A lot of times it's really the only trails that are cut, and the deer trails naturally go from island to island a lot of times anyway. So same type of situation, like you're getting your scent in that muck, you're getting your scent like as you're dragging through those cattails, like you just can't really avoid it. And cross country through cattails is just not super practical and super noisy. So similar type of thing where it's just like, maybe in a scenario like that, I'm staging more, right? Where you start on one island, you hunt it. Next time you go to the other end of the island or you go to the next island. A lot of times I'll do that scouting too, where I plan, like I could hit 5 or 6 or 7 different islands, but I'm going to check the first one. If the sign looks good, I'm going to hunt it. The sign doesn't look good, I'm going to go to the next island and then the next island. And sometimes it might be that I get to island 5 or 6 and it's like, man, I don't even find any, like hardly any fresh sign, no open scrapes where there should be scrapes this time of year. Not a lot of deer sign, not even a lot of oak caps from earlier in the year. And I just walk back to the truck and don't even set up. Like I've definitely done that before because then I know the next day I'm going to go on a totally different loop and just keep doing that until I find that stuff I want to set up on. But if I find something that's fresh, I don't want to necessarily go past it the first day, and then if that doesn't produce, then go a little bit deeper.
Makes sense. Let me formulate this question here. So you've been scouting for a long time. What do you feel like are some things that you pick up on now when you're out there that you notice that you didn't immediately notice right away that you would say a lot of guys aren't paying attention to?
If it's early season, I've gotten a lot better at finding browse sources and just like where you can kind of look at the lower lying vegetation and be able to tell what's like deer have been feeding through this. That's something that's, I'd say it's hard unless you've like scouted with somebody that knows what they're looking for. And I've had the fortune to be able to like over the years hunt and scout with people that knew a lot more than I did and could like teach those little things. It's like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, that makes total sense. And then the next time you're out there, then you're able to start picking up on it. So especially early season, that's been pretty big. As far as the spring scouting, I'd say I've certainly gotten better at identifying scrapes and which ones are good and which ones are not, because you might go out and find, 6 or 7 scrapes on one day scouting, or you might go in, there's a marsh that we potentially some of us have probably hunted the same marsh, where I've gone out and I've counted like 46 scrapes in one day of scouting. It's like, well, how do you know which ones are good and which ones are not? And the context around that, and just like what the licking branch looks like, what the bedding adjacent to the scrape looks like, what the cover looks like how pocketed it is. I've gotten a lot better at determining which ones I actually need to be at if I want to see daylight movement.
That's cool.
Any tips you want to share about that? Like what to look for in a good looking scrape, or are you going to keep that to yourself?
Well, I mean, it's easier to show, harder to describe, but a lot of it has to do with context. It seems like the best ones that I find, it's almost like I'm in an area that's already kind of like dense or thick, and there could be bedding, kind of anywhere within a couple 100-yard radius, especially in like those bigger woods places where you got clear cut and you got blowdowns and you got marsh and, a little swamp, and like deer could bed at any of that. And so I might be walking on an edge between like 10-year-old aspen and like swamp, and it's kind of like weaving through, and there's a bunch of deadfalls, and it gets kind of like thicker, higher stem count for a ways, and then you're just following along the deer trail, maybe see a rub here and there, and you're pretty much narrowed down to like one trail. And then all of a sudden it just kind of like pops up into this like small opening, and then you start looking around, sure enough, there it is. You start seeing licking branches. You almost even see the licking branches sometimes before you see the opening on the ground. And then you stand in those spots and then you look in all the different directions. It's like, okay, well, this trail's cutting through here, but there's probably bedding up there. I can go confirm that. There might be bedding over there too. I can go confirm that. And then you might find that on the back side of that, there's 2 different exit points. So you might have like a 3-way connection point of travel that's super dense, and that helps congregate that deer movement. And then if that also does coincide with bedding that's close by, doe bedding especially, then those are areas where it's like, it might be super hard to access and get into, but like even for running trail cameras over those types of scrapes, it's like those are the ones that oftentimes just get a ton of daylight activity, especially sometimes throughout October, but late October especially, and into November. And they can, in some instances, be less hunted. Not always the case, but if you find those small spot on a spot type scrapes that contextually make sense, but they're not super obvious on a map, then you might have less hunter pressure, which again, probably part of the reason why you tend to get more daylight activity there. So I maybe have a collection of like, let's say one property, I have like 3 spots that are kind of like that over like 5,000 acres. So they don't come up very often, but it's like, if you told me like, hey, you have like 3 trail cameras to put out to try and get like as many mature bucks in daylight as possible. It's like, okay, I'm going to put them here, here, and here. Like all on scrapes, all in these areas that I know are going to produce daylight activity. And they tend to be hard to access. So those are like the things. It's like context around it, good licking branch. I've seen some that are like the thick licking branch where you got, it's kind of like looks worn. You might have it like a deer hair sticking in it. But I've also seen ones that are just like broken over, and they, like a witch's hand, and there's little branches everywhere. Sometimes it's like red oaks. Sometimes it's like white oaks. Sometimes it's spruce sometimes, occasionally. But most often I see where it's rubs on the aspens, but then you might have like a little shrubby red oak that has a lot of branches kind of at the same level, like eye level-ish, plus or minus. And you might have like 3 scrapes kind of surrounding that tree that basically can almost connect and make it like a 10, 15 foot long scrape. And if that's like the pocket that you're, and it's surrounded by thick, and you have 3 different deer trails going out, it's just going to be a money spot usually.
Yeah, I feel like that resonates for sure. Like, I know we talked earlier, but I feel like of all, I have, let me backphrase. I have used to be able to scout a lot. Different seasons of life, I've career changes twice in the last couple of years. Young kid, so like I used to scout a ton, and now I am more of like I have my 5 to 7 really good spots, historical. Like they've historically been good for 2, 3, 4 years in a row. So I don't put as much of my time into scouting and more just learning those areas better. And I think I've found 2 or 3 of those scrape situations like you've talked about, not just exactly the same, but we're like, they're historical and they're there every year and they're 100 times better than any other scrape I've ever found. And it's just fascinating. And I am intrigued by that because like that's something I have a lot to learn in is keying on which ones, because yeah, you can go scouting, find a bunch, but which ones are the best? And boy, are they the best by a landslide, and that's, I try to put my camera there as well. But on that, for you personally, I know that, I don't care if it was on or off when we were recording, but you work full time on top of what you do in the hunting world. So for you, like, do you rely heavy on cameras? Obviously, you do a lot of scouting, and that's great. But do you prefer like historical trail camera data over your scouting? Or, and second part of that question is, do you kind of lock into spots that you've done this over, your career in hunting, or do you really love finding out 1 or 2 new areas every year? What's kind of your personal strategy on that? Hunting historical, or more like I want an adventure in this every single year and not hunting the same places I've had success in before?
No, great questions. I'd say it's kind of a mix in terms of what I like, because there's things I like about either aspect, like having the history on a particular spot, or you can like a particular deer and then like kind of feeling like you figured it out over a couple of year span. Like that's super rewarding. But by the same token, it's fun just like not using the cameras and just finding a spot, setting up on it, be like, I think this is the spot. And then it just produces. Like that's super rewarding as well. I would say from a success standpoint, I've had more success on the non-camera route, where maybe even have cameras around like in the area, but where I'm actually set up, I don't have any historical information. It's just where the scouting led me to, or if it's out of state. I filled more tags doing that, but I will also add that the size of the deer that I'm shooting, like doing that, is not the size of the deer that I usually will get on camera in some of those areas where I'm building up the historical inventory. And so again, it's like I have different expectations. If it's an area that I've been hunting for, 6, 7 years, and I tend to know the spot on the spots, and I tend to know the type of deer that area will produce, I might have different standards that I set for myself in those areas. And I might be willing to pass on a deer that if I was out of state, I'd be more than happy to shoot. So it's a little hard to compare them from that aspect, but it certainly plays a difference.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Yeah, because like that's something I'm learning big time in, and I'm not good at. So it's fascinating to hear someone like you who've seen like those specific scrapes and be able to like communicate in a way that you can learn. Because it's like I know that it's a good scrape, but why? I don't have a clue. Other than 4 years in a row, there's just awesome bucks on it, and every time I go in there and not kill one, they don't come back for 2 weeks. So it's one of those spots I just go to like 1 or 2 times a year, and you can't go in there any more than that. So those are just fun learning. I love it.
And it can change really fast too. Like you can have an area that has been historically great for a decade, but then maybe 1 year you get 3 mature bucks that are overlapping, and it's torn up everywhere. You got rubs, big rubs all over the place. And then guys are scouting and they find that. And then the next year you got all the stuff that you've known historically to be good, cameras everywhere, tree stand, like it just totally gets infiltrated with hunters. And then it just kind of like, it almost kind of gets like refreshed for like years potentially, until guys get fed up with it. They start hunting other spots. Like they didn't get the success they were hoping to. And then the hunting pressure starts to kind of filter back down. And then those spots might start to get good again. And it could depend too on with clear cuts, especially the size of the clear cut. I mean, the amount of cover and food that's in a clear cut of a certain age, it can be like dead for a certain period of time, and then for like a number of years really, really good. and then like, gradually less good again, just depending on what it has to offer at a certain size range. So I've found that like the best clear cuts for me during the rut tend to have trees that are in like we'll say like 1 to 6 inch range. Kind of varies a little bit, but then another factor along with that is like they might have trees that are mixed in and blown down to create additional cover, and lots of like grass and weeds and ferns and briars, to where like you don't want to walk through them without brush pants because you're going to go out torn up. Those tend to be really good in terms of like what separates a good clear cut from a bad clear cut. In my experience, that tends to make a big difference. Because once they get big enough that you can easily walk through them, then guys start walking through them. You got grouse hunters and whatever else, and it's not the same.
Totally. Makes sense. Garrett, I think it's time. It's time for the showdown with Crockett. You ready for it?
Let's go.
I love it.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we're having a ton of fun building this, and so we just love having fun with Crockett. We even made Crockett respond with, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget his name right now. Johnny, help me out.
Ron Swanson, Nick Offerman.
Ron Swanson quotes from Parks and Rec whenever possible. Hold on here a sec. AirPod died. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I have got a random piece of public land in Iowa.
It's 1 mile from my house.
This time it's only 1 mile from Jeremiah's house. And I asked Crockett, I said, where should I hunt? How should I access, or where should I hunt? Why should I hunt there? And how should I access it? So I'm going to ask you the same thing. And I may have gone a little big with this. So just do your best. Take as much time, not a ton of time, but sometimes to look at this. I realize we're just kind of throwing this at you, but we just thought it'd be fun. And maybe Jonny and Jeremiah, you can give your take too. Yours doesn't matter as much as Garrett's does, but you can
Correct.
still try.
Correct. Yeah.
And then I did this earlier today, so we already have Crockett's responses, and we'll see if you agree or think that's dumb or think that's what everyone else would do, which is what you alluded to earlier. So let me share this.
I just showed up.
All right, Garrett, just start talking. Like, what are you thinking right now? What are you processing? Like, what do you see?
Yeah. So obviously I see the road system. I see the creek system moving throughout. And what I don't have a good feel for is potential access up top. But if I'm assuming that a lot of the access is from down low, then that can be, I think in some cases, helpful versus access up top. Or, like Southeast Minnesota, sometimes we have places where there's access up top and down low, and pressure could come from anywhere. But it looks like, just from what I'm seeing, most of the pressure would come from down low here, which, again, like is good. But what I can't tell from an access standpoint is, where are there hunter trails that jut up into the woods? It looks like maybe there's one coming off where that road does a 90-degree turn going to the west. It looks like there might be one kind of in the 5 o'clock portion of the screen where it starts to go up into that little drainage. But what I would tend to do at this like stage of my scouting is I would actually like not look at the aerial. I would flip back and forth between like LiDAR as well as the sun and shade maps to be able to get a good feel for how steep those slopes are, because the topography lines don't necessarily, like, it's hard to get a feel for how steep they are, because some areas, just depending on how dense the lines are, will appear different than others based on the scale of the land. But if I look at it on LiDAR, or if I look at it from a sun shade map, that can give me a little better idea of like how steep is that potentially, how could the thermal start going up and down those hills. But if I find areas that are steeper,
pause real quick. Where are you?
that might.
Yeah, sorry. Where are you accessing those? The shade maps and the other thing you referenced. Is that an Onyx feature, or is that a Spartan Forge? I don't know what you use.
No, so that's actually Spartan Forge was what I would use there. So the sun shade actually just got added recently, but between the LiDAR, the slope angle, and the sun shade, those are like the big three of the topography mapping tools, in addition to the like satellite views. But for hills, for me, they go hand in hand. So I'm going to do this just based off of the the satellite with the hybrid view, but in reality, I would be using all of those in conjunction with one another. So I really like the looks of that northwest pocket, and to a maybe lesser extent, that eastern big chunk of woods. The reason I think that the northwest is kind of drawing my eye a little bit is because initially my eye got drawn to that east central chunk. There's more fields up there. I think that's going to draw more people potentially as well. And like I mentioned too, it looks like at the 5 o'clock position of the map, there's that little like trail that seems to be heading up there. I would bet, given that this is Iowa, there's probably a hunter access trail that goes right up to that like section of fields up there, because they got to get their equipment up there anyway to farm whatever they have in those fields. So more than likely than not, that place is probably getting more pressure. But again, it might be big enough of land that it's not a huge deal. Also being in Iowa. So that northwest chunk, it looks like the fields that are there, potentially you could get equipment in from the west, not have to go like up from the bottom. And so there's a lot of little micro diversity there on that big major ridge. There's a lot of secondary ridges and little ins and outs. Yeah. And there's on the top also a little bit of mix of just the density of the tree cover. It doesn't look like it's just all one monoculture mature like oak forest. Especially when you get up to kind of that like horizontal line where like on our map it says like the states, like the E of the state. Yeah, like along that horizontal line, you start to get a little bit more edge. So up in that area, I'd be interested to scout some of that edge and look for sign. But then also as you go southeast from there along that primary ridge, looking at all of those secondary points that come off of it. Those are definitely drawn my eye. If I was scouting this place, I would just basically do a loop at like the military crest level around that whole entire primary ridge and look for sign. It could be too that off of that very tip of that point, it looks pretty steep just based on the topo lines. And you got that creek at the bottom. I wouldn't be surprised to find it right at that creek. Because for somebody to hunt that, you either have to come in all the way from the northwest, or you'd have to cross that creek and march right straight up that hill. And depending on the tree density at the tip of that point, a deer could bed around that point and have really good visibility to that road below. So it seems like, to a certain extent, maybe somewhat obvious, but based on challenge of somebody actually getting in there, it might be a relatively decent spot. There could be deer bedding there. And that one that's just north of it on that east side of that primary ridge, that little secondary ridge also to me kind of stands out that I would expect to see most likely bedding there. So if I was going to scout that's the first place I would look before I check out the place on the east. I can't quite exactly tell with the resolution there if it's if that's like just kind of grassy, weedy on the top there, or what exactly is going on there.
It kind of looks like it to me.
It looks like meadow almost, if I were to guess, but
yeah.
Yeah,
if it's like weedy, I would almost expect there to be like good scrape. Like that'd be a good place to look for scrapes too.
Yeah, right along the edge between the hardwood and the meadow.
Yeah, back in the LiDAR point though too, you'd be able to tell with the LiDAR like where all the hunter access trails potentially go there. So you might find that there actually is a hunter access trail that walks right up that ridge, and that would totally change my decision. But
Yeah, sure.
It looks pretty steep off that point.
So
like there might even be vertical. Might be vertical. Bluff to a certain extent.
First of all, Jonny and Jeremiah, are you seeing anything else on here of intrigue for you guys that you would go check out?
I want to talk through a little bit of my thought process, and Garrett confirmed it for me because my eyes immediately went to northwest, those fields there. Then I was like, wait, Garrett would not go there, I think, because that's where my eyes went first. And so then I was like looking in that chunk that he started describing, and I was like, spot on. But when I'm looking at just, say it's not public land, say it's your own piece of property, you could check out whatever. I'm looking up near the top, near that other landowner. And if you see, right up in there where those creeks combine and then come down into the one creek, my experience, and I've hunted a lot of creek bottom. I have creek bottom on my property. My experience is right where those two creeks come down and join. there's going to be a really good trail, because any deer that comes down, and it is a ridge too, it looks like, any deer that comes down, funnels down into that space, has to cross in that area. That's where my mind goes looking at a map. I don't know if, Garrett, you have any thoughts on that or experience with something similar?
No, I totally agree, especially if it's a rut type hunt. It's harder to pull off, I feel
Right.
like, hunting in the bottoms, but for finding sign, like, yeah, there could be ditch, like super heavy ditch crossing type trails, depending if there's water or not in those creeks. It's it's a little bit of a gamble because you don't know what's directly north of that. Like, it could be a parking lot right there. Like, it's tough to know. But I definitely
Yeah.
agree with what you're saying.
Jeremiah, anything you're seeing on here?
No, it's gonna sound like I'm just copying for real, but yeah, that northwest corner definitely intrigues me. I mean, all the different terrain features. Yeah, you got the fields there, but east of there, those ridges. But I just love without the different types of LiDAR and the shading, but there's so many different types of habitat. It seems right where your mouse is, like, converge there, and plus obviously you got the ridges, the points. But I've never been to Iowa or hunted much for hill country in any way, shape, or form. I think I'm going to drive my first Iowa take next year, so I'm excited about that. But anyways, that area definitely intrigued my eye most definitely first. And
Nice.
so, yeah, I love it. That's good stuff. I'm excited to see what Crockett thinks.
Let's see what Crockett thinks. And then the great thing about it is we can tell him if he sucks at it. We'll make it better. Okay, here's what he says. Bear with me here. All right, so he's got 3. Number 1, saddle on the east ridge. So just northeast of the beep, beep, beep state rec area label on the south-facing slope. Northeast, south-facing slope. So he thinks here. His rationale for that is this is a classic travel corridor. Bucks will cruise through the saddle parentheses low spot between the 2 high spots to check for does while staying out of sight. The northwest wind. Oh, I did tell it there's a northwest wind, so this is probably what he's saying. Northwest wind.
Of course there is.
Will be at your back, but thermals will be pulling up in the morning to balance it out. The thick cover on the leeward south side of the ridge gives bucks security. What do you guys think of that play? So if I'm interpreting that right,
Is it talking about just
he's
writing
thinking right about here.
where your cursor? Oh, there's 2 cursors. Wait, hang on.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. So
where your cursor is on mine is like at the base of the ridge.
Yep. He says northeast of this. So I would be around here, I'm guessing. South-facing slope of the big ridge. So that's why I landed here with the northwest wind. Okay. What do you think?
It looks like, it's between 2 fields, whatever. But it looks like it certainly could be a travel corridor, and it's on a ridge system. So sure, Crockett, I'll buy some of that.
Some of that. Here we go. All right, let's see what else he says. Let's see. Creek crossing pinch point, west side near Ivy Road. Best for an all-day sit. West of Ivy Road. Doesn't make sense to me.
I think he's talking about that pinch point kind of right near the road.
Right here?
Maybe, or the one even closer to the road. I'm not sure.
Okay.
18 yards off the road.
Yeah,
18
exactly.
years.
That's what it looks like.
It says where the creek bends sharply and is pinched between the steep terrain. That might be here, I guess. I don't know.
Crockett's a road hunter.
He's a road hunter. Probably between bedding areas. Wind will be hitting the ridges, but the lower elevation will keep it stable, allowing it to hunt without swirling winds. Those are likely to bed near ridge points, and bucks will scent check them from below. Does that sound right to you guys?
I'm waiting for Garrett.
Yeah, crickets over there.
I mean, it definitely could be that you could have deer cruising along the edge of that road with a northwest wind. So, I could give it points for like somewhere in that area along that creek bottom. Like there could be deer running during the rut, but outside of the rut, I don't know that those would be good spots. So
Right.
it's tough to with the context that you asked it, was it specific to rut or is it just like general deer movement?
Yeah, no, I said November and I said northwest wind.
That could be like one of those, maybe Crockett's really smart and it can anticipate those overlook spots, like those. Well, I've had a spot that's been pretty good 50 yards off the road before, and that could be one of them. You never know.
There you go.
So the way that creek opens up into that big giant bottom where all the roads are. So depending on, the speed of that wind, it could potentially funnel out the bottom there. Like if it's going west-northwest especially, could start to flow out generally without much swirling in that bottom. But as you get further and further northwest, I would expect to start seeing more and more swirling, depending too, how high the sun is that day, if it's, cloudy versus sunny. Yeah, once you start to get up into that smaller stuff, I would expect to see more swirling in the creek bottom. And usually I would expect that if you had rising thermals up on those ridges, I would be hunting up high, which is my 2 cents, instead of down low with the northwest wind, because then you'd have that thermal mixing up higher on the ridge.
This one, the last one, is Ridge Hub intersection southeast of Ivy Road and Hill Road. Best for an afternoon evening sit southeast of the main road intersection where multiple ridge points converge near the creek. You guys seeing that? Is that this over here?
I believe so.
Yeah. This is a terrain hub. He says, deer coming from different bedding areas will meet here. The northwest wind allows you to set up on the downwind side of the ridge while bucks cruise just below the ridge line. Multiple travel routes intersect, increasing your chances of seeing cruising bucks. What do you guys think that intersecting ridge lines?
I think historically,
it's gotta be what it's talking about, kind of where you have your mouse in that.
Yeah. And I think historically, like I scouted a spot this year and I was looking at a map similar and I found where a bunch of ridge points came together, and just as I suspected, there was a ton of sign there and turned out to be a really good spot. So I think that's kind of what he's getting at, where terrain features come together, can be a good spot.
There you go.
I mean, it might just be missing not seeing that, obviously, that road that Garrett pointed out earlier. You take that road out of there and put a different spot. I mean, that bridge looks very intriguing, but if it's not that something 80 yards off of a walking trail could be terrible per se, but obviously take into account that potential of that being a huge road that goes up to those fields, even for farm equipment. But other than that, yeah, it's a juicy looking spot for sure.
I think Garrett wins. That's what I'm going to say.
I think so.
Garrett wins.
You win, Garrett. You have defeated the AI. Welcome. Good job. Good job. Well, Garrett, anything else you want to say about scouting? Anything else that you were thinking about as we were talking?
Well, I would say probably the big takeaway for me, for anybody listening, is be intentional with the scouting and have a good idea of what you're trying to get out of that particular scouting day. Are you intending to try and find beds? Are you intending to try and find rut travel corridors? Are you intending to find good isolated food sources that you can spot check on closer to the season? Are you intending to just, generally get a feel for the landscape in a new area and find where there might be hunter sign? And think about, when you're going to be hunting that time of year. Is it going to be an early season spot? Is it going to be a late season spot? The more contextual things you can put together as you're planning your scouting trip, the more specific you can be in terms of what you're actually looking for. And I think the more effective you can be, and just really try to focus on edge, right? But you can cut out 80% of the stuff that's just wasting your time. You get 80% of the information from 20% of the actual land area if you're following areas where you're going to have the highest concentrations of sign on those edges.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Well, Garrett, thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for humoring us with our little AI exercise. And thank you again for sharing your wisdom. And we're excited to follow along where future seasons take you. It's been entertaining and we learned a ton by you sharing your wisdom. So Thanks so much, man. Really appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's good talking to you guys.
Good stuff.
Hey there, thanks for watching this video. I'm JD, founder and crew member of the HUNTXP team. We're so grateful that you took time to watch this video, and hopefully it's helping you level up your hunting game. That's what we in our community is all about, and we want to invite you into this growing community of hunters that's all about leveling up each other's hunting game. So the first thing you can do is like and subscribe, but even more than that, we got some fun things going on over at our website, huntxp.com. We'd love for you to join our community there and stay connected with what we're doing, what we're working on, and we'd love to hear about what you're after. So thank you for watching this video. We'll see you next time.
Behind the scenes bonus banter.
So you're going to get a turkey hunt in before baby comes?
Well, we'll see how efficient I am and what things are like in May. But potentially, if things go right, I can probably kill 2 in April, just between maybe Iowa and Minnesota.
There you go.
Usually, it seems like my best week historically is always the D season of Wisconsin, where it's like May and plus or minus a few days, May 8th through 3rd. For some reason, that time, it's like clockwork. Every day you can get out one. But sometimes earlier than that, Minnesota's a little different because you can get out there opening week and it's close enough. I can drive and I can locate birds ahead of the season and have 5 different birds located, but a little bit different in Wisconsin. You got to drive a little bit further. I know I love turkey hunting, so we'll see. I'll definitely tailor it off as it gets into May for sure.
Do that for your wife's sanity. As experienced husbands of wives' children, taper off a little.
Yeah.